Again, my name is Sarah Foltz Jordan. I am a Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society based here in Minnesota. And going to give you a little bit of information again about Xerces, narrowing in just on our pollinator team here. So we have staff nationwide. Here in the Midwest, we have myself in Minnesota, based on a farm about an hour north of the Twin Cities. Jim Eckberg is here in St. Paul. He's a plant ecologist. And then Thelma Heidel-Baker is an IPM specialist in eastern Wisconsin. And we also have Jennifer Hopwood, who's in Omaha, Nebraska, and she's doing a lot of really neat work with habitat and roadsides. Again, we do pollinator conservation education to farmers and farm agency professionals and other folks. We've conducted training events in all 50 states on pollinator conservation. More recently, we've been talking a lot about habitat conservation for other beneficial insects, specifically those insects that are really important in natural pest control on farms. And again, we do a great deal of habitat restoration on the ground nationwide. Okay, so this should be simply a reminder to you now, because I talked about this earlier today, but we have roughly 400 different native bee species in Minnesota, and many of these bees are specialist pollinators on a lot of our crops. Typically plants that evolved in the Americas or have close relatives that evolved in the Americas, not surprisingly, have native pollinators that are really well suited to pollinate them. So this includes our tree fruits, cucurbits, tomatoes, sunflower, many of our berry crops like blueberries and cranberries. And of course, these insects are contributing billions of dollars in free pollination annually. This is a picture of a sunflower bee. And with honeybee decline and colony collapse, I'm not going to talk too much about those issues, and maybe somebody else will be later today. But I just wanted to point out that as we're faced with all of these issues with our honeybee populations, there's been more attention turned towards native bees and what their role is in crop pollination. And really, it turns out they're very important pollinators. This was a global study of 41 different crops, and what they found was that fruit set in all crops significantly increased with flower visits by wild pollinators versus only 14% of crops that increased with honeybee visits. And in crops with improved fruit set by both groups, wild pollinators improved the fruit set twice as much as honeybees. And this better pollination by native bees is attributed to a number of different factors, including some that you're probably familiar with. So a lot of you have probably heard how a lot of native bees are active in cool weather. A lot of them are really fast flyers, so really efficient pollinators. Some bees, as I talked about earlier, can do this thing called buzz pollination, which is really effective for certain plant species. And other ways that they interact with flowers. And I think it might make sense if you look closely at these photographs here. So these are all apple blossoms. And this over here is a honeybee. And you can see that this honeybee is not actually interacting very much with the anthers of the flower, which is where the pollen is. Rather, it's just going in and getting nectar. Compare that with these mining bees on the right. Can you guys see how the bees are all over those anthers, getting a lot of pollen on their body? So this is just one example of a type of bee that is really quite effective at pollination. Honeybees are great in that you can move them around, and you don't have to have a lot of forage all season long to support them. You can move them on and off farms and in really high numbers. Clicker. I could maybe just go over here and use, okay, there we go. I also mentioned this a little bit earlier. There's more than just pollinators that are out there performing really important ecosystem services on farms. So things like lacewings. Here is an adult on a flower. The larvae are voracious predators of soft-bodied insects like aphids. Lady beetles, both the larvae and adults, are predaceous on other insects. Ground beetles, nocturnal predators, really important in pest control in some crops. Parasitoid wasps, which are probably the most important and least visible natural enemy on farms. Some of them are very, very small and hard to see, yet doing really important work. And predatory bugs. And I don't have hoverflies shown here, but hoverflies are an example of an insect where the adult is a pollinator and then the larvae, in some cases, are predaceous on things like aphids. So we know all these insects are important. We also know that habitat is key to attracting and supporting populations of these insects such that they can make a meaningful dent on pollination and pest control. And people always want to know, how much habitat do I need to have to ensure that my pollination needs are met or that my pest control needs are met? And really, not surprisingly, it depends on a lot of factors, including your landscape context, the crops that you're growing, the pest issues that you're dealing with, the pesticide use on the farm or pesticide history on the farm and in the surrounding community. But just to give you a few examples of studies that have tried to put a number on this, this was a study in watermelon in which they found that if more than 30% of the area within 1.2 kilometers of a crop field, either on or off the farm, is in natural habitat, that growers can achieve full pollination of, in this case, watermelon by native bees alone. And looking at the pest control side of things, this was a study that found that if more than 20% of a farm is in diverse habitat, pest control by beneficial insects is observed throughout the field. So not just at the field edges closest to the habitat, but throughout the fields. Okay, and this probably isn't too surprising to you. So pests thrive in monocultures, but beneficial insects need more. And yet another study finding that landscape complexity enhances natural beneficial insect populations in 74% of cases. So we need complexity in our landscapes. And habitat is a good way to introduce that complexity. We also know that habitat pays off. This is a study in Canada, in canola, and they found that in the absence of honeybees, canola growers make more money on their land if 30% is in natural habitat rather than planting it all. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but this is because native pollinators increased seed weight per plant by 18% and market value by 20%. And there are similar findings in blueberries. So in 2011, Michigan researchers observed 12% blueberry yields in plantings that were, in crops that were adjacent to wildflower plantings compared to blueberry fields that just had controls, lack of those wildflower plantings. And these increased yields are expected to pay off the cost of establishing that habitat in 3 to 4 years. Okay, so I work primarily on farms, doing work one-on-one with farmers to design and install and try to find funding for putting habitat in the ground. And my approach when I visit a farm is typically, first and foremost, to identify and protect existing habitat. And it's funny, a lot of times I find farmers apologizing to me for certain areas of their farm that are messy, maybe brush piles that they haven't gotten around to burning yet, maybe rock piles that they haven't had the time to clear out of their fields and level off. So all of these things that are actually really important habitat features for beneficial insects, yet we tend to not always recognize as such. So first and foremost, identify and protect what you already have. Second, identify habitat deficiencies. So figure out what you're missing and where you could be doing better. And that might be spring bloom. It might be having a diversity of native wildflowers. It might be nesting sites for ground nesting bees or for cavity nesting bees. A number of different ways that habitat can be deficient. Finally, you want to prioritize strategies, new habitat typically, that can address these deficiencies. And Xerces has developed a few tools to help guide farmers and conservation planners through this process. We didn't include these in your toolkit, but there's a number of them on the back table. But basically, it's just a form where you go through and score yourself in all these different areas: foraging resources, nesting resources, and then protection from pesticides. And my favorite part of both of these documents actually, is a section asking a farmer to look at different ways that they can reduce the need to use insecticides on their farm in the first place. So things like crop rotation, cover cropping to build soil health, planting resistant varieties, having a farm that exhibits whole farm diversity, so lots of different crops grown, lots of different wild species in the farm edges, tolerating low levels of pests in recognition that those pests are important food for your beneficial insects that you're trying to build up populations of. So anytime you see a pest, you shouldn't just spray it, because then you won't get beneficial insects there to take care of those pest issues. So pick up these tools if you're interested, and they're also on our website. I'm going to talk now about a number of different habitat installations that farmers can use to increase pollinator resources on their farms. So I'll talk through each of these, starting with field borders. And I'm going to read this quote by Aldo Leopold that goes like this: "There are idle spots on every farm, and every highway is bordered by an idle strip as long as it is. Keep cow, plow, and mower out of these idle spots, and the full native flora could be part of the normal environment of every citizen." What do you guys think? Does this ring true to you still, especially this first part, there are idle spots on every farm?
Sure, more or less.
I think, yeah, it's kind of mixed. I would agree with you right here, more or less. I feel like here in the Midwest, we still have these idle spots. Every farm that I go to has fallow areas that are typically weedy and could easily be converted to habitat. But I would also agree that those areas are shrinking. And in my own community I'm near Princeton, I have seen field borders ripped out. I have seen crops creeping closer and closer to the road, such that there no longer even is a ditch, a flowering ditch in some places. I've seen areas that were historically considered too wet to plow, turned and planted in some years, but not all years. But as you guys know, you can't get those plant communities back just like that. More or less, yeah. Another thing that I think is interesting in this quote, Aldo Leopold wrote this in the 40s. And so when he was writing this, I imagine it was as simple as keeping cow, plow, and mower out of these beautiful native plant communities that were still around. Now it's not that easy. Now we have invasive weeds. Typically we need cow, plow, and mower as tools to do these restorations and try to create plant communities that resemble what we have lost. But I love this last part. The full native flora could be part of the normal environment of every citizen. It's amazing to me. I grew up in the Midwest. I work as a conservation biologist, and yet I still know very few of the native plants in this region because they're so sparse in our landscape. Not all of them are even available for restoration if we wanted to use them. Okay, so continuing with field borders. These are just a few examples of farms where we have installed field border habitat. This one I'm calling out for two reasons. One, to show you how quickly this transformation can happen. So this was seeded in 2009, and by 2011 it's already beautiful, flowering, providing a lot of floral resources. And also this farm is no longer bringing in bumblebees for pollination. They're achieving full pollination by native bees. And you can see how the bumblebees are supported all season long. So they're foraging on the crops in the spring, and then the rest of the season they're building up their population numbers by using these other resources. And this is a farm in Oregon, but I'm calling it out because, again, we have diverse field border habitat. And they're not using insecticides, even for spotted winged Drosophila, even in a state that is probably more riddled with spotted winged Drosophila issues than we even are here. So probably thanks to this diverse habitat that's supporting a diversity of insects to help keep pest issues in check. Another habitat option is what we're calling insectary strips, perennial insectary strips. And these are essentially the same thing as a field border, except the placement is different. So instead of putting habitat on the edges of the farm, we're working with a number of growers who are really interested in bringing that habitat into the interior of their farm, where pest control and pollination services are most needed. And that's kind of in light of what we were talking about earlier with flight distance of some insects being pretty small. So it can be important to put that habitat where you need it. And this is an example from a farm that I've been working with out in Montana, and some of my coworkers at Xerces have been working with them for a while as well. But basically, these guys are growing around 4,000 acres of organic small grains and oilseed crops. So it's a big farm. We've been working with them to integrate native plant strips into their farm, these 30-foot wide strips. And the strips are composed of around 20 or so species of native drought-tolerant forbs and grasses. And what this slide is showing that this is really multi-purpose. So the strips are not only supporting pollinators and beneficial insects for pest control, they're also reducing overland runoff, serving as a weed buffer for active cropland. Something that we didn't even anticipate, but that they've been noticing is that the plants are pretty tall, and they're collecting a lot of snow during the winter, which is bringing more moisture into their fields. They're serving as corridors for wildlife. So the last time I was out there, we saw pronghorn running through, which was just amazing, and they've seen fox and all kinds of animals using these strips as well. This is an example of an annual insectary strip. So I think of annual insectary strips as sort of the gateway drug to more serious perennial habitat. Because they're easy, they're cheap, they're temporary. It's not like you're committing this acreage to something for a very long time. Minimal site prep. These can be used in and around high tunnels. They can also be incorporated into cut flower plots. Another example of a way to get more habitat on a farm is the strategy of cover cropping. I think this is just a beautiful picture showing crimson red clover intercropped with vegetables. Again, multi-purpose, providing insect forage, building up organic matter in the soil, nitrogen fixing, weed control, etc. And if you want to learn more about cover cropping, and there's some really cutting edge information right now coming out, in particular of North Dakota. Gabe Brown would be a good farmer to just Google and watch a video. But these guys are basically just using really diverse cover crop mixes as ways to improve soil health and reduce their reliance on insecticides, chemical fertilizers, and in some cases herbicides. I won't go into too much more detail than that. We do know that these plantings work and can increase predation of pests. So this is a study looking at soy and buckwheat. So when buckwheat was planted adjacent to soy, wasp parasitism of stink bug eggs was increased by 2.5 times. And I just want to point out how tiny these wasps are. So this is the stink bug eggs, and that's the wasp. And we have a new tech note on cover cropping for beneficial insects. There's some on the back table if you want to learn more about this topic. Beetle banks is another way to bring in more habitat on a farm. Basically just a strip of native grasses, pretty cheap to install, pretty easy. And the idea is you're introducing perennial habitat into a system that's pretty regularly tilled on most vegetable farms, and thus supporting populations of ground beetles and other predators. Hedgerows are another great habitat feature. I find myself recommending hedgerows in situations where spring bloom is limited because a lot of our native flowering shrubs bloom quite early, or where nesting resources for cavity nesting bees is limited. These hedgerows also can provide screening, wind and dust reduction, living snow fences, harvestable fruit or tea. A lot of our native shrubs have edible berries or leaves and are important for wildlife. Couple examples of hedgerows. This one on the left is pretty simple, just native berry, food-bearing shrubs, elderberry and currant. And then on the right is one that's more diverse and also has a forb component. So there's the shrubs and then there's wildflowers next to it. I'm not going to talk through this in much detail, but I just want to point out that hedgerows support populations of beneficial insects that are important in pest control, and these beneficial insects move into the fields and perform those pest control services. There's good research supporting these ideas about habitat increasing pest control. And we also know that these hedgerows pay off. Jake talked a little bit about plantings in wetter situations, drainage areas, and I will just reiterate, these plantings can be really multi-purpose, capturing sediment, nitrogen, nutrients, increasing infiltration, reducing risk of pathogen loads in water. Understories are another place, a little more challenging place to try to incorporate flowering habitat. This is an example of a vineyard out in Washington where we installed a diverse native planting in between all of the aisles. And amazingly, what they've found is that they've had no leafhopper damage in 2013, which was a record outbreak year for leafhoppers. Presumably because of the diverse habitat that these plantings provide. And I'm working with some folks here in Minnesota to incorporate native understories in apple orchards. So I'm excited to see how some of that work turns out. Drift protection is the last thing I want to talk about. This is a farm in Northfield where I've been working. You can see conventional row crops in the background, organic blueberries in the front, and just this drift protection buffer composed of coniferous trees to try to capture some of the drift that might be coming off of those fields. Spruce and fir and juniper are great. I'm going to rush through this a little bit because I want to give Jim time. The last thing I want to show you is a little case study from another local farm in Northfield. This is Open Hands Farm. They're growing around 30 or so acres of organic vegetables. And I worked with them on a pollinator conservation activity plan. This is a map of their farm. And basically the first thing we did was walk the farm and try to identify areas that were not being used for anything else and seemed to be kind of a no-brainer for putting in habitat. So the fallow areas, too wet, too dry, too irregularly shaped, for whatever reason or other, they were not being cropped. So we're planting habitat in those areas. They also really were interested in bringing that habitat into the interior. So we've planted insectary strips in some parts of the farm. I think they're 10 or 12 feet wide. Drift protection on one corner, and flowering hedgerows in a few places as well. And all over the farm. These guys are cover cropping. They're letting plants bolt rather than just ripping them out when they're done. They're growing cut flowers and herbs. They're doing invasive species control, understory plantings and woodlands, leaving dead wood. There's all kinds of things that you can do all across the farm to support pollinators. And this is all I have. There's a few resources that I'd like to point you to. This one on the left is in your packet, your toolkit already. I wanted to let you know about a workshop, upcoming workshop about monarch habitat on farms. This is going to be in Farmington on April 1st. Free workshop. Do come. It should be great. And that's all. Thanks, you guys.
A little bit about my farm. My wife and I operate about 5 acres of perennial fruits, and we call it Blue Fruit Farm. If it's not blue, we don't grow it. If it has thorns, we don't grow it. Those are one of my wife's criteria. And as I mentioned, we are located on a 360-acre land co-op, Wiscoy Valley Land Cooperative, and also on this land is where Prairie Moon Nursery started, so one of the major suppliers of native plants here in the upper Midwest. And we are growing a number of different perennial fruits. So here's the list of things we're growing. The Aronia, which is the black chokeberry that Jake talked about. Blackcurrants, these are the European blackcurrants. Also about 1,600 blueberries and several different varieties of elderberries. These are selections from the native elderberry. Honeyberries, or otherwise known as hascaps, they're a non-native. Yostaberry, which is a cross between the blackcurrant and gooseberry. Juneberries, otherwise known as service berries or Saskatoons. They're a native, but primarily from the Great Plains, Montana, Dakota, Saskatchewan, and then a number of different types of plums. And then we also have planted quite a few species of native plants that then we harvest seed and sell through Prairie Moon Nursery. And that's our website, bluefruitfarm.com, and we have quite a few people sign up from our website and place orders, things that they're interested in. We sell a lot of our fruit locally in the Winona area through the food co-ops, but also to some restaurants here in the Twin Cities, such as Birchwood Cafe, that will be providing lunch here as soon as I'm done talking. So get on with it. This is a row of the Aronia or black chokeberry, and this is a cultivar Viking. Even though the Aronia is native to North America, all of the breeding has happened in Scandinavia and former Soviet Union. And they're very popular in those areas. They have 4 to 10 times the antioxidants of blueberries. Truly kind of a super fruit, and are very attractive to beneficials. Now here's a fly, the Diptera, and actually it's not just bees, but also a number of flies pollinate as well. And then these are the fruits of the Aronia, which are about the size of a blueberry, but they all ripen at once. So they're much easier to harvest. Very high tannins and astringent. So you can eat them, and they're juicy, but they make your mouth feel dry. They desiccate your mouth immediately. So some people actually do like them or throw them into smoothies, things like that. But a lot of times they're processed into jams, jellies, juice, wine, or mixed with other fruits. This is the Juneberry, and there's types of Juneberries that are shrubs and some that are trees. And they are native. We'll find the trees in our woods here occasionally. These are incredible pollinator species. And we only have about 60 of these, but when I walk down the row and they are one of the first blooming, it is just buzzing. I mean, I'd love to set up a video and capture, because there's all kinds of different native pollinators that are working these flowers. And then here's what the fruit looks like. Prior to ripening, they do turn a dark purple when they're fully ripe, but they're edible when they're red. They're a high protein berry, and the birds just are crazy about them. And the only way that we get any harvest is now we have the whole field under overhead netting to protect from birds that we cover when the fruit are ripening. This is the honeyberry, and it is in the same genus as the honeysuckle, which is an invasive in our woodlands. But these bloom here within a month. They'll be blooming when we're still getting hard freezes. And the bees that are active, especially some of those bumblebees, will be working these flowers. I think I've got a close-up, of the flower. So a lot of pollen that they're putting out. And then this is what the fruit looks like, kind of a oblong, about 3/4 of an inch long. And they ripen before strawberries. And you can eat these fresh. They do have a flavor similar to like a slightly underripe blueberry. Here's some of the elderberries and one of our attempts to scare birds away with these fake owls, but it helped right in about a 5-foot area around the owl, but wasn't very effective. But you see these are like 16, 18 inches across, the flower heads, the cymes, and then here's the fruit. And these are all selections from the native elderberries. And then this is a plant that I found in our woodland and now am propagating, and it's the native wild blackcurrant. So very different than the European blackcurrants, and has a showy cascading yellow flower, very popular also with pollinators. And the fruit is much more palatable. The European blackcurrant, very tart, very high vitamin C, 4 times the vitamin C of citrus. These are a much milder flavor, and we're just still propagating those. Even Prairie Moon Nursery doesn't offer these for sale yet. Just something I happened upon while mushroom hunting. So some of the things that we think about for pollinators, just really maximizing the biological diversity, and Sarah's done an excellent job talking about the importance of that, but also the genetic diversity. Different ecotypes that are well adapted in our driftless region. So we work closely with Prairie Moon on those. But also keeping things blooming throughout the year. So providing those early food sources, and a lot of these perennials, as Jake stated, do bloom a lot earlier than some of the warm season native forbs, which are much later. But we have things blooming from mid-April till hard freeze at the end of fall. Thinking about, and Sarah talked about, providing the different types of habitat that provide food or harborage also for nesting. So some areas where there's bare soil, that's okay, so long as it's not an erosion potential. Mulch piles, things with hollow stems, and the elderberry is another one of those that has a hollow, pithy stem. And then things with cracks, crevices, some wet areas. The pollinators all need moisture, and boy, they do flock to areas where water pools. And avoiding sides. I mean, the insecticides, the pesticides, the herbicides, and One thing a lot of people don't know, that Roundup or glyphosate actually is not just an herbicide, but it is registered as an antibiotic, that it kills soil organisms. It also has impacts on pollinators. So it's not just avoiding the insecticides that cause direct death, but also things that cause just harm to their vitality. So before we put in the perennials, we did cover cropping of the strips where we were going to plant them. So this is buckwheat. We did that both to get weeds, because it's an excellent smother crop. It helps build fertility, but then we would let it go to flower, and tremendous pollinator. Here's actually a kind of naturalized honeybee, I believe. And we do have wild honeybees that live in various trees in the woods. But in our garden, whenever we harvest early maturing things like garlic or early potatoes, put some buckwheat down and let it bloom. And it's going to winter kill. If it makes viable seed, you may have it come back the next year. But just think about how you can keep things blooming in your garden after you harvest one crop. Put in a cover crop in the beds. It's not hard to do, and it really pays benefits. So here, this is my wife Joyce. Boy, that's kind of a funny looking picture the way that, anyway. And so you see, this were the Aronia just at the spring where we planted them. And so we used shredded bark mulch to suppress weeds, but that also provides some pollinator harborage nest sites. But between all of the rows, we had planted various clovers, primarily white Dutch clover. So that blooms, and a number of different bees like it, but primarily honeybees. And just last year, we did have 12 honeybee hives on our place. And one thing I found, you got to keep in mind, honeybees are not native, they're European. They're a confinement animal, so they're not free-ranging, and they like things as simple as possible. So they love white Dutch clover, and they love the dandelions. So they're going to work kind of the easy food, and they don't work some of these fruits that we have near as much as the natives, especially the bumblebees. But here we have blueberries blooming, and we have a flush of dandelions in between. We don't worry much about that. They come and go. I'll come in fact, I was just getting set up to mow when it's dry enough, and mow and try and keep some of that from going to seed. But it's great early season forage, especially pollen, for the bees when there's not a lot of other things blooming. We had the fortune of being in the Minnesota Cooks calendar last year. So this is a picture, Joyce and I, this is just another day on the farm, I like to say, walking down the row, singing, holding hands. But the reason I put this here is really what we're walking over is a row of the New Jersey tea. And so here's a close-up of a bumblebee working the New Jersey tea, but a lot of different species, including some of the really microscopic pollinators, work this particular crop, and then we harvest the seed and sell that through Prairie Moon. Here's a butterfly weed. It's in the milkweed family. Beautiful flowers. And then here's a monarch larva just ready to form the chrysalis there, hanging in the butterfly weed. And I think Sarah mentioned the mountain mints. This is the hairy mountain mint, and it is incredible. It's late blooming. It blooms right up till freeze, and a lot of different species work that. So we've planted clumps of the hairy mountain mint between all of our plum trees. So here's a wasp working those flowers as well. We've also planted anise hyssop, and we collect the seed from that. It's a wonderful smell. I love just working this plant. But you see a different species of bumblebee, and then I think there's a honeybee in the background. And here's another one. I got too many pictures of these because I like it. But also some of these photos are from Prairie Moon Nursery. They shared some photos here. This is late in the season, just outside of our field. There's about 60 acres that's all in natives for harvest, for seed for Prairie Moon. So the New England aster blooming, one of the last forbs to bloom. The showy goldenrod, a lot of people familiar with the Canada goldenrod, but there are many more beneficial. So you see bumblebees as well as the longhorn beetle, I think, working that. But just, and this is the rigid goldenrod, so you see it just covered with different pollinators. And I think this is a stiff goldenrod with both a bee and a butterfly. And don't forget about the common milkweed. They come up. I always leave some in the garden, leave them, and then hopefully there'll be some monarchs that find. And the common milkweed is another native, but this. And I'm always watching out for the monarchs and hoping to find the caterpillars. This was in my garden a few years ago. And here's one of the asters being worked by a bumblebee. Echinacea, we don't have it in our blue fruit farm, but we have it all around. And I think the fact that we have this diversity really, we don't have insect pest problems except plum cucurleo in our plum trees is really the only thing that we're having a problem with, and not so far with the spotted wing Drosophila either. So the bumblebee sex there on the bergamot, and the larkspur, liatris, and some more. This is similar to a picture we saw earlier, just all the monarchs. I mean, they're there to drink pollen. They're not collecting, to drink nectar. They're not collecting pollen. They're really doing much of anything. And swallowtail. And yeah, one thing I might mention, both the monarch and the black swallowtail, it's been found that the BT crops, the genetically engineered corn that has insecticidal protein in every cell of the plant, that the pollen from the BT corn has been found toxic to both monarchs and black swallowtails. And that's not really talked about in the whole monarch decline. It's loss of habitat, but also that BT toxin is toxic to lepidopterans. And we know it's established that it's toxic to the monarchs and black swallowtails at the very least. So this is a pale blue aster, also another late blooming plant. And it's not just bees and butterflies, but also the hummingbirds are a pollinator attracted to red flowers. So this is a cardinal flower, another native, very showy, wonderful thing to have, around your home or in landscaping, and it will attract the hummingbirds. So this is a group of University of Wisconsin lacrosse students. Every spring we have come out, and we have to figure out something for them to do. So they want to work, and so we were planted about 200 trees. Our farm is just on the other side of that 9-foot deer fence. That's another one of our main pests is deer. We couldn't do anything we're doing if we couldn't protect from deer. So that's the first step. But on the outside, we planted a windbreak of white spruce in one line, and then alternating crabapple and American cranberry bush, viburnum, every other on the inside of it. So here's the students after we'd planted all those in too little time, so then they got to play volleyball. But some of the things we do to avoid the use of those insecticides, a lot of monitoring and actually physical removal of different insect eggs. This is elderberry rust that affects them when it's hot and humid. So late June, first part of July, a little scouting and removing these kind of fascinating banana-like growths on the stems really takes care of it. We just have to do it for about a 2-week period, get that out of the field, and that's the end of it. But also monitoring for plum cucurleo. So this is what's called a tedder trap, and our feed on the south side of our blue fruit farm is woodland, and so they overwinter in the leaf litter, and then we find them, especially at the south end. We have the traps throughout the field, but most of the activity is on the south. But here's what these little critters look like. They have a snout. They're a weevil, but they are a challenge for us. And we do a little bit of flame weeding, but one way we use either this long-handled flamer or just a propane torch handheld is for the tent caterpillar. You'll see those in our plum trees, but you see them on roadsides, etc. And it's not that big a deal, and especially just a small handheld propane torch, just heat them up a little bit, and that's it. You don't have to spray anything. It doesn't harm the tree. It only targets that pest, and it's only for a couple-week time that you need to be looking for it. And then the spotted-winged Drosophila was mentioned. This is it's a major pest that's just been in this country since about 2008, really impacting fruits like raspberries, blackberries, grapes, blueberries. Just all day yesterday, I was in Atlanta on a big organic research advisory team about control of spotted-winged Drosophila. There aren't natural enemies. They're imported from Asia, and so we don't have the balance to keep them in check. None of the parasitoids going after them. There's trapping, but that's really only effective for monitoring to confirm that you have a problem, but not for control yet. So this is what they look like, and the key to their success is, compared to other fruit flies, these are unique in having what's called a saw-toothed ovipositor, where they will light on green fruit before it ripens, and they actually can saw their way in and lay their eggs inside the fruit. You don't really know it. There's not a scar or something that you can visibly see, and when you discover it is when the customer is looking at your raspberries and sees maggots crawling around. Not good for business. So we're looking, the only effective pesticide that's approved for organic use is spinosad or Entrust, but guess what? It is broad spectrum and kills pollinators. So we really are looking for other ways, management of the landscape. There are people working in Asia to, collect the various, parasitoids, things that are part of that ecology that we can possibly use in this country. So. But it's a major threat to both organic and conventional fruit growers now. And yeah, this is just proof that I went. So another thing that, I talk about all we do to enhance biodiversity, and one of the outcomes of that, and this is something my wife thinks is a threat, are the timber rattlers. So we have rock piles. I'm not ashamed of them. But they are habitat then for mice and ground squirrels and chipmunks, which then are a food source for the timber rattlers, which we do have native in the driftless region, southeast Minnesota, northeast Iowa, western Wisconsin, on the remnant prairie areas where we do still have that Aldo Leopold remnants that we can collect and then propagate plant species from, but those rocky outcroppings that warm up in the sun, and there's lots of little holes and fissures, perfect habitat. And then occasionally, when the conditions are right, the rattlesnakes will move. And this one was in our mowed lawn, and I was in the garden, Joyce was up by the garage. She's the one that spotted it, screaming bloody murder. The UPS driver pulls up right at the same time. Don't get out of your truck. And she's, Jim, come. And okay. So I got we have roadside recycling throughout Winona County, which is great, but we have these bins, these totes on wheels, so I dump everything out, bring it out there. I have a 10-foot rod, and I've done this a couple times now, of lifting the snake and putting it in this tote, and then closing the lid, and we luckily live in a pretty remote area, so I could go around, and it's still within 2-mile range, which you don't really want to relocate for the snake's own good, more than 2 miles away, but took it around the other side of the hill and released it. Hasn't been back, or others haven't been back. But anyway, I think it's great. I mean, to me, it's a sign of ecosystem health when we have creatures like this in our front yard, and they are not aggressive whatsoever. They're kind of like the bumblebee. You really have to prod them. And, I go and lift it, and, it just wants to get away. It's not coiling up like you see in the movies, wanting to strike. But the noise they make is not what you hear in the movies either. It's more of a buzz. Zzz, anyway, it has nothing to do with pollinators, but when you do the ecosystem enhancements, it's not just the pollinators, even though we're planting for pollinators, but as Sarah has talked about, it's all the beneficials, and those provide so many I hate that word actually, ecosystem services, as if it all revolves around us. I mean, how can they serve us? How can we learn to live within our ecosystem and be part of a healthy environment? That's really our goal. So thank you.